Alright, so let's take a next step in our cardiovascular system and talk about the heart, the blood vessels, and circulation. This first part, we're just going to look at the heart anatomy and overall review of the cardiovascular system. So, the cardiovascular system includes the heart and lungs. Although we'll look at the lungs more specifically when we get to the respiratory system, the lungs play a huge role in the cardiovascular system, and of course there's an interplay between the heart and lungs, as they're both within our thoracic cavity, and there's an intimate relationship with this oxygen exchange that takes place. So if we just take a look at the center of the screen and we'll look at the heart, for example, blood flows through the heart. It comes into the heart from the tissues, so from your arms, legs, brain, etc. comes into the heart in low oxygen levels are in this blood, because the blood has just delivered oxygen. So in other words, there's high carbon dioxide concentration and low oxygen level in the blood that comes back to the heart. So your heart bypasses this blood over to the lungs, where it can pick up fresh oxygen and get rid of carbon dioxide. This is called the pulmonary circulation route. That blood then comes back from the lungs, re-enters the heart. Sorry, I keep losing my mouse here. That blood comes back from the lungs and re-enters the heart on the other side. And then that blood, which is now full of oxygen and devoid of carbon dioxide, goes back out to all of the body tissues, goes back up, into the brain or into the arms or legs or abdomen or wherever it needs to go. It diffuses through the capillaries, exchanges oxygen and carbon dioxide, and then flows back up and then over to the lungs and then back in and then out to the body and over and over and over. So this circuit includes the pulmonary circulation, as I mentioned, which is picking up oxygen and dropping off carbon dioxide in the lungs, as well as the systemic circulation, which is doing the exact opposite, picking the carbon dioxide up from the tissues and dropping the oxygen off for metabolic purposes within the tissues. In general, the right side of the heart has lower blood pressure than the left side of the heart, and that is because of the amount of musculature as well as the overall effect. So the right side of the heart is the receiving side of the heart from the systemic circuit. So the blood comes in from all over the body onto the right side, and the right side is just small pumping, not a lot of contraction force, that deoxygenated blood or low oxygen blood over to lungs. So it doesn't have to have that much oomph behind it, doesn't have to have that much pressure behind it. Whereas the left side, you can see this thick muscular wall here, the left side has to produce a lot of oomph to get that blood to go all the way up to the brain, or all the way down to the feet, or all the way down to the tips of your fingers. So there's a higher pressure area on the left side of the heart. If the right side of the heart were to have increased blood pressure, that would strongly influence the diffusion rate of oxygen and carbon dioxide at the lungs. The lungs may not be able to diffuse the oxygen and carbon dioxide as efficiently, and that would result in lower oxygen levels within the blood and higher carbon dioxide levels within the blood, because it just can't diffuse that quick out of the lung tissue. So as I said, the heart is made of two pumps. It contracts about 100,000 times a day. It pumps over 8,640 liters of blood a day. The right side is collecting that oxygen-poor blood from the body and sending it to the lungs, and that left side is collecting that oxygen-rich blood from the lungs and sends it back out to the rest of the body. So its location and size is about the size of your closed fist. So if you close your fist and look at it, that's about the size of your heart. So the bigger you are, the bigger your fist, the bigger your heart. The smaller you are, the smaller your fist, the smaller your heart. It's about 12 centimeters long, 9 centimeters wide, 6 centimeters thick, about 300 grams in mass. It rests on top of the diaphragm in the midline of the thoracic cavity. It's enclosed within that mediastinum, the area between the two lungs. It's about 2/3 of the mass of the heart is on the left side of the body. So it's kind of like a cone that's laying on its side in the way it is orientated. The apex, or that tip of that cone, is right on top of the diaphragm. The base is actually forming the upper chambers of the heart. So as I said, it's kind of an upside down or sideways cone, whereas the tip is at the bottom and the broad base is more superior. Here you can see its overall location. Here you can see the orientation of the right and left lungs. This is anterior. This is posterior. You can see the vertebral column here. The heart is in between the two lungs. You can see some major blood vessels here. Lots of fatty tissue. The esophagus and trachea are in this area as well, delivering nutrients and gas. Here you can see a more anterior view of our heart. Heart is within that thoracic cavity, in between the two lungs, within the mediastinum. You can see some of the major blood vessels flowing through the mediastinum, that esophagus and trachea towards the back of our thoracic cavity. You can also see our heart is surrounded by lots of fatty tissue. The fatty tissue holds the blood vessels, the coronary arteries and veins in place, as well as provides insulation and protection for our heart. You can also see the overall shape of our heart, as I mentioned, kind of a cone laying on its side. The point, or the apex, is towards the bottom, resting on top of the diaphragm, and then the base is up here, holding the superior chambers of our heart. Let's talk about those chambers. The heart itself is enclosed in a sac called the pericardium. There are actually two receiving chambers to our heart, the right and the left. The plural for atria is atrium. So there are two atrium. There are two pumping chambers within our heart, and those are the ventricles, the right and left ventricles. The right side is dealing with that deoxygenated blood coming back from the systemic circuit. The left side is dealing with the oxygenated blood coming back from the lungs. There are four major heart valves. There are AV valves, or atrioventricular valves. The atrioventricular valves are separating the atrium from the ventricles, and there's one on each side of the heart. So the tricuspid valve is on the right side. I associate that T in the word right with the tricuspid. And the bicuspid valve, or mitral valve, is on the left side. I know the word left has a T in it also. I usually tend not to pronounce the T in left. I just say left. And that reminds me that the right side has the tricuspid valve. I don't know. It's weird, but if it works for you, use it. These valves have to withstand high pressures from the contracting ventricles, so they're very powerful and strong valves. There's also semilunar valves. These valves separate the ventricles from the major arteries, and there's one major artery on every side of the heart. There's the pulmonic valve, which is on the right side, and the aortic valve, which is on the left side. These are typically dealing with smaller volumes of blood compared to those atrioventricular valves, and so they also deal with lower blood pressure being exerted on the valve. So they're a little more sensitive and not as durable as the AV valves are. There's the heart muscle itself, which is called the myocardium. The cardiac muscle, if you recall from our lectures on muscle tissue, has intercalated discs, and that is kind of like the little cardiocytes holding hands so they can say 1, 2, 3, contract, 1, 2, 3, contract. That's exactly what those intercalated discs do. It allows for that syncopated contraction, that cell-to-cell signal transmission that needs to take place in order for a nice organized contraction. There's also tissue found between the connective and epithelial tissues called the endocardium and epicardium layers. Here you can see those layers as I was talking about. You have your pericardium, which is that serous membrane, that sac that encloses our heart in its chamber. You have the heart wall itself, which is made of myocardium, and then the inner lining of our chambers of our heart is called the endocardium. The myocardium itself is made of those branched cardiocytes connected through those intercalated discs, and the other layer that I need to mention is the epicardium. The epicardium is actually the inner lining of the pericardium. So if you recall, our serous membranes have a visceral and parietal layer. This is going all the way back to chapter 3. That parietal layer is lining the cavity. The visceral layer is usually sitting on top of the organ. So the visceral pericardium is also called the epicardium. It's just the outer covering or outer layer of the heart. Then you have the myocardium, which is the muscle, and the endocardium, which is that inner lining. The walls, or the chamber walls on the inside of the heart, vary in composition. The atrial walls are very thin because they just collect and pump the blood only a very short distance to the ventricles, which are just below. So they don't have to require much force with their contraction. It's kind of like a sponge wringing out the water, so to speak. It's just a little squeeze that they have to give. The left ventricle wall is the thickest wall, and that's because it has to pump the blood through the entire body. The right ventricle wall is thicker than the atria, but thinner than the left ventricle wall because it's only pumping the blood to the lungs. As I mentioned, that right side has a much lower blood pressure than the left side, and that's again because it does not have to pump the blood as far. Here you can see some of the anatomical features that I was mentioning. Here is our right atrium receiving all of the blood from the systemic circuit. Notice that it's blue, the blue veins coming into it. That leads to the tricuspid valve on the right side. That tricuspid valve is the gateway from the right atria to the left ventricle, to the right ventricle rather. That right ventricle leads to a semilunar valve called the pulmonary semilunar valve that pushes open to allow that blood to flow to the pulmonary circuit to the lungs. The lungs will allow for oxygen exchange, so those lungs allow for our blood to become oxygenated, and that blood re-enters our left atria right here through these pulmonary veins that you see, dumping the blood back into this left atria. Then separating the left atria from the left ventricle is this bicuspid or mitral valve. Once the blood enters the left ventricle, it's now surrounded by this thick myocardial wall. That force of contraction pushes the blood up and out of this aortic valve, up through the aorta and around to the rest of the body, up to the brain, down to the fingertips, down to the toes, etc. Some of the other features in this diagram you see are the chordae tendineae. The chordae tendineae are the heartstrings, so to speak. They pull on the valves to allow them to open. You can also see the papillary muscles. These are special muscles that root those chordae tendineae strings in place, and those papillary muscles contract, which allows the pulling or increase of tension on those heartstrings. There's also an interventricular septum. A septum is the anatomical term for wall, so this is the wall between the two septa. And I think that is it in terms of labels on this diagram. Let's talk about arteries and veins. I was kind of alluding to them in that last diagram. Arteries carry blood away from the heart, and veins carry blood toward the heart. The heart itself is supplied through the coronary arteries, which branch off of the aorta. The aorta is the big major artery coming off of the heart. And then those coronary arteries drain into something called the coronary sinus, which dumps into the right atrium. So the coronary arteries are delivering blood to the heart muscles themselves, which is why if you have a coronary bypass surgery, literally what they're doing is they're rerouting the blood vessels on your heart. Not the blood vessels that deliver blood to the rest of your body, but the blood vessels that are supplying your heart muscle itself. Here you can see some of those major vessels. So this is the anterior view of the heart. You can see the two major veins coming into our right atria. This is called the inferior vena cava. This is the one that's bringing all of the blood from the inferior area of the heart. Abdominal pelvic cavity, legs, etc. are all returning blood via the inferior vena cava. Up here you have the superior vena cava. This is returning blood from the head and upper limbs. That blood's going to go into that right atrium. The right atria is going to squeeze the blood into the right ventricle. The right ventricle is going to squeeze the blood through that pulmonary valve into what's called the pulmonary artery. The pulmonary artery, arteries away, always carrying blood away from the heart, in this case over to the lungs. It branches off into right and left pulmonary arteries, which go to either the right or left lung, where it picks up oxygen. Then the blood is brought back to the heart via the pulmonary veins, which you see back here, the right and left pulmonary veins on either side of the heart. They both dump into the right, or rather left atrium up here in this corner of the heart. The left atrium then dumps that blood into the left ventricle, which squeezes the blood out through the aorta. The aorta is the major artery carrying the oxygenated blood away from the heart. You can also see the aorta here. It ascends, it curves, and then it descends down the body, just about to the end of your spinal cord, and then it kind of branches off down the legs. Here you can see the back of that aorta. As I was mentioning, it just would continue straight down this way, branching off throughout your abdominopelvic cavity. You also get a better view of your inferior vena cava and superior vena cava. You can see your pulmonary arteries and your pulmonary veins delivering that blood to the left atrium. You can also see that coronary sinus. The coronary sinus is collecting the blood from the coronary circulation, which supplies the heart muscle itself. So let's talk about pressure gradients within the heart. The cardiovascular system is a closed circuit, so it follows a loop. The blood does not leave the vessels. It's only the gases and nutrients and waste products that are exchanged. Blood itself stays within the blood vessels. Contraction of the heart chambers ultimately increases pressure of the fluid within the chambers, and then that pressure gradient causes blood to flow. Just like when we were talking about diffusion and osmosis, and how molecules like to go from areas of high concentration to areas of low concentration, blood in this case is going to do the same thing. It's going to flow from high pressure to low pressure. So, as the atria contracts, that increases the pressure within the atria, forcing those AV valves to open, and the blood is going to flow to where there's lower pressure within the ventricles. When the ventricles contract, the pressure of the blood increases within the ventricles, forcing those semilunar valves to open and allowing the blood to enter the arteries. The two atria contract together when the two ventricles contract together. So you get two syncopated contractions. The atria contract, the ventricles contract. The atria contract, the ventricles contract. And what that's doing is controlling the flow of blood to the lungs and the flow of blood to the body. Let's trace the path of blood through the body. Let's start here with number 1. Number 1 is that blood starting in that right atria, flowing through that tricuspid valve on the right side to the right ventricle. Blood from the right ventricle will then flow up through the pulmonary semilunar valve to the pulmonary arteries, out to the right and left pulmonary arteries, out to the lungs, where it picks up oxygen, diffuses the carbon dioxide. It returns back to the heart via the pulmonary veins here at step number 5. The pulmonary veins return to the left atria. From the left atria, when the left atria contract, it's going to push that blood back down into the left ventricle. The left ventricle will then contract and squeeze the blood out through the aortic semilunar valve, out to the aorta, and out to the rest of the body. If we follow this diagram of blood flow, it's the same thing. It's just not in the heart diagram. It's more general. So you get your pulmonary veins picking up that oxygenated blood, returning it to the left atrium. Oops, I started at the wrong part here. Here's our right atrium with deoxygenated blood from the various parts of our body. That deoxygenated blood travels to the tricuspid valve to the right ventricle, through the pulmonary valve, through the pulmonary trunk and pulmonary arteries, to the right and left lungs, where it picks up oxygen and diffuses that carbon dioxide out. Those pulmonary veins carry that oxygenated blood back to the left atrium, flows to the bicuspid valve, goes to the left ventricle, through the aortic semilunar valve, to the aorta and systemic arteries, in the blood system. It's going to lose the oxygen, pick up carbon dioxide, and the whole system starts again. We'll stop here for part 1.